We're going to be continuing in Mark chapter 6 this morning. Mark chapter 6. And last week when we last saw Jesus, he performed one of the more popular miracles, feeding of the 5,000. And there was at least 5,000 men, let alone, women, children. So there could have been 10 to 15,000 people total there. We don't really know. But he basically fed all those people with just a small amount of bread, small amount of fish. And it says that, when the entire crowd had finished eating, there was 12 baskets of leftovers. And that's just interesting because Jesus could have multiplied the bread and the fish just enough to feed everybody without a crumb left over. He could have done that. He did not need to make sure there was 12 baskets of leftovers. And I thought to myself I'm like, why did he do that? He didn't need to. They didn't have refrigerators back then. So why did he make so much extra? Because it wasn't an accident. It wasn't at the end of it and he's like, oh, we got leftovers? I didn't know that. It was on purpose. And as I'm thinking about this, one verse popped into my head, Ephesians 3:20 through 21, where Paul says, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, according to the power at work within us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen. I think the reason why Jesus made 12 extra baskets full of food is because he wanted to make it clear that he is able to do far more abundantly what we can need. How much more can he do than what you ask? You ask, Lord, give us this day our daily bread, and he gives you 12 basketfuls of leftovers. That's how much far more abundantly. I think he's wanting to prove a point. He's showing, I can do more than you can even fathom. I think that's why he did that, and that's an amazing lesson. But then as we continue the story here in Mark chapter 6, verse 45, it says that after this is done, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. So Mark uses his favorite word here, immediately. If you've ever read through the Gospel of Mark, if you ever were to sit down and read through the whole thing at once, you'd see that word immediately over and over and over and over again. I've heard it said before, if you read the Gospel of Mark in one sitting, you'll be out of breath by the time you get done with it. So after the crowd is done eating, there they are with the disciples and with Jesus, and it says Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and leave the area. Now, just a normal reading of that verse doesn't really portray the gravity of the situation. The word that Mark uses for Jesus making his disciples get in a boat and leave is the way we picture what's going on here might not be the same way that Mark is portraying it. The word that Mark uses there is unusually forceful. Jesus is not just telling his disciples, all right, guys, it's time to move on. It's the imagery of this word, he's literally shoving them into this boat. So the crowd is done eating, and Jesus is saying, okay, guys, get in the boat and go now. It implies that there's hesitancy on their part. Maybe they're looking at they're just standing in awe, and Jesus is basically saying, guys, get in the boat and go now. He's literally ordering them to get in that boat and leave. Why in the world would Jesus be so urgent in forcing the disciples to get out of that situation? Well, remember, last week, we when we were going over this story, we read a couple verses from John's account about what was in the mind of the crowd. And I'll just read those again, John 6, 14 through 15. It says, when the people saw the sign that he had done after Jesus fed them, they said, this is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. And perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So this crowd was not just a bunch of people just wanting to hear Jesus. They're looking for a way to begin a revolution against the Roman Empire, and they see Jesus as the guy to lead this rebellion. You might remember a few weeks ago when we were looking at John the Baptizer in prison, and he is in prison. He sends his disciples to Jesus to say to him, hey, go and ask Jesus if he's really the Messiah to come or if there's another person. And most likely John asked Jesus that question because John probably bought into the popular view of the Jewish people that the Messiah is supposed to be a political rebel who is going to come and kick Caesar off the throne and take over the Roman Empire and make Israel the top dogs in the land again. And that's what the Jews thought the Messiah was going to do. So if John the Baptist was able to get caught up in that misunderstanding, and we know how dense the disciples were at times, how easy you think it would have been for the disciples of Jesus to buy into that mindset of everybody. So Jesus had to get them out of there before they began to be, can you imagine if back in that time they had CNN and Facebook and all this stuff, and the disciples are on social media in between talking to Jesus? Jesus, there's this guy who says that you're racist and stuff like that. Anyway, that probably would happen, I guarantee you. But he's got to get these disciples out of there because they're going to start believing this stuff if they see it. And then in verse 46, it says, after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. You see that often, Jesus just getting away to pray by himself. And I think that shows us there a key to the life he lived. When I read, about pastors in the past and throughout church history, especially when I read about pastors who were so fruitful, they saw so many people saved, so many people transformed, and obviously you wonder how did that happen? What made their ministry so successful and fruitful? And obviously some of them were geniuses, and some of them were such incredible speakers and all this stuff. But what I often find is as I'm reading these stories of these different ministers, what I'll find is how often they got alone with God. How often they just got alone with God to cry out to him. And it's like, that's the reason, that's why their ministries were successful. That's why there was fruit. It's because they got alone with God and just cried out with God and wrestled with God in prayer to move. And that's what Jesus did. This is probably what I've said more than anything else since I've been pastoring here, but everything is dependent on our seeking the face of God. John Wesley said something pretty bold statement. He says God does nothing except in answer to prayer, and that's a very interesting point. Obviously, God does what he wants whenever he wants, but we do see in Scripture an amazing amount of times where God does things based on the people that call on him. And there are times when he says, I would have done something, but nobody asked me. He says that in Ezekiel. He said, I wanted to redeem, I wanted to restore, I wanted to help. And then he says, but I looked for someone to stand in the gap, and I didn't see anybody. He's in that path. He says, I looked for someone who was going to call on me to move, but I didn't see anybody. So guess what? I didn't fix anything because nobody's asking me. James, isn't what James says? You have not because you ask not. And so whenever I see Jesus getting alone to pray, I'm reminded that that's the key. That nothing else will matter unless we're seeking the power and presence of God. So as we continue here, verse 47, and when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. Jesus was alone on the land. And he saw that the disciples were making painful headway, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. So according to Mark, the time now says the fourth watch of the night. That would have been in between 3 and 6 a.m. And here's what's interesting to me is that you got to remember, many of these disciples were fishermen, right? It's not like they didn't know how to be in a boat. They spent most of their lives out on the water. And so when Jesus tells them to get into a boat and go, they've got no problem, right? Because they might spend more time in a boat than they do on land. They've been in storms before. They're not afraid, we'll go, sure. But a storm comes up that they cannot get through. And the word used to describe the trouble, I think some translations mention them rowing. They're having trouble rowing. They're having trouble against the wind. The word that is used to describe their trouble literally means torment. It's the same word that is used to describe demons. The same word. It means a tormentful thing. Now, I don't think the storm is demonic, but it's so hard. It's torture for them trying to get through it. And once again, remember, many of these fishermen were very familiar with water. And so in the middle of something that was so familiar, they were having a lot of trouble. And it just made me realize you never know when a storm is going to hit your life. You never know. Even if you try to keep your life very predictable and stay with what you know and want to stay with what you're comfortable with, which is what I like to do, you realize there are situations you have no control over. Doesn't matter how predictable you make your life. There are things that you cannot control, and something could come along and start to torment you at any given moment. No matter what you've done to prevent it from happening, it's going to happen at some point. But notice what the beginning of verse 48 says. It says, and when Jesus saw the disciples, straining at the oar or being tormented by the rowing, even though Jesus rushed them into the boat and then he went off to pray, Jesus still has kept an eye on them. He's still watching them. He hasn't just forgotten about them. Jesus always has his eyes on those who are his. No child of God is ever alone. And I think of in Exodus, I think it's Exodus 3, when the Israelites are in slavery, and it says their cry for help came to God's ears. No matter what was going on, God always is hearing his people. He's always watching his people. Now, what's interesting in verse 48 is there's actually two things in verse 48 that clearly demonstrate Jesus as God. The first is that it says that Jesus came to the disciples walking on the sea. Now, the Old Testament has several references to Yahweh God walking on the sea. Very many references, but one I want to look at in particular is Job 9:8. Talking about God, it says, God who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. Now, something important to just kind of remind us all of. I've mentioned before in other sermons that before Jesus was born, right, the Roman Empire took over Jerusalem, as they did most of the known world at that time. And when they did this, they made everybody speak Greek. The official language of the Roman Empire was Greek. So if you wanted to be able to function in society, you had to learn Greek. Especially if you were involved in any sort of commerce, you had to learn the Greek language, or you were just going to be, lost. And so because of this, the Jewish people made a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And this Greek translation would have been the Bible of the apostles. And we know this because many of the Old Testament verses that are referenced in the New Testament, when you look at them, they're from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Because they have different words than the Hebrew Old Testament. And what's interesting is that a lot of Muslims will try to use that to disprove the Old Testament, because they think, well, the Hebrew Bible says this, and the reference to this verse in the New Testament is different. Well, it's because the apostles weren't referencing the Hebrew Old Testament, they're referencing the Greek Old Testament, because that's what they used. That's what everybody spoke. And so in Mark 48, when it says Jesus walked on the sea, Mark is using the identical words that Job 9:8 says when it says that Yahweh God walked on the sea. He's using the exact same words. Coincidence, huh? No, it's not a coincidence. Mark knows what he's doing. He's saying Jesus is God. And after Jesus began walking on the sea in Mark 6:48, it then says he meant to pass by them. And initially, that sounds like Jesus was intending to just go by them and not even talk to them, not even stop. He was just going to walk right by them. But I don't think that's what this is saying. And I think this is the second indication that shows Jesus as God, because that phrase, pass by them, that was a really significant phrase for Jewish people. Because if you remember, when Moses asked God to show me your glory, remember God said to Moses, you can't see my face because you'll die. But God said, but I will let you see the back of me. And he says, I will let my glory pass by you. So many times in the Old Testament, God references himself as passing by. And if we go back to Job 9, in verse 11 of that passage, Job says, behold, God passes by me, and I see him not. He moves, but I do not perceive him. So what Mark is doing, once again, by saying Jesus intended to pass by them, he's referencing these moments in the Old Testament where the glory of God would pass by. So he's saying Jesus is God. God walks on the water. Jesus walked on the water. God passes by people. Jesus passed by people. He's literally talking about Jesus as being the one and only God in this passage. So if we move on to verse 49, it says, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost. And they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. It's interesting. So the disciples thought they saw a ghost. That word in Greek is phantasma. Probably sounds familiar. Phantom, apparition. That's what they thought they saw. Which I'm with them. If I'm out on a boat, if I'm fishing at night, and I see some figure walking, I'm probably going to need a change of clothes. Yeah. But Jesus then had to speak to them. He had to talk to them and speak to them and tell them to not be afraid before they would even recognize it could be Jesus. Why is that? Why did they have no idea that was Jesus walking on the water? Well, the end of this story tells us here. Not only did they not have a clue that this could be Jesus walking on water, but the end of the story in verse 52, it says, for they did not understand about the loaves. They didn't even understand how Jesus could do the miracle with the fish and loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Their hearts were not in a place where they could see all of who Jesus was. That's why, remember when Jesus says, I have to die, and Peter rebukes him and says, no, you'll never do it. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Because what Peter was saying right there was not of God. It's interesting, the disciples' hearts were hardened and they couldn't understand. And so, when you see somebody, when you talk to somebody who's in total rejection of Jesus, you have to realize their heart is hard. That's why they can't see. That's why they can't understand. And only God can soften somebody's heart so they can understand who he is. Now, the whole event of Jesus walking on the water and getting into the boat is amazing if you think about it, because I don't know about you, but in the past, whenever I thought of these stories of Jesus walking on the water, when I pictured it in my head, I always had this image in my mind of Jesus walking on this completely still, flat body of water, not even a ripple at all, just calm and quiet. And I realized that is the opposite of what was going on here. Jesus was walking on the lake during a storm that was so bad, it was tormenting the disciples. The waves are strong enough to make them unable to move the boat. And Jesus is walking on that. Can you imagine what that would have looked like? Just waves, who knows how high, tossing the boat everywhere. And there's a guy walking on it. And the waves probably were not moving him at all. He was just walking right through it. But here's what God wants us to see in that. When you're being tormented by some sort of storm in your own life, Jesus is going to be walking directly to you in that storm. Not only that, Jesus didn't calm everything down and then get in the boat. He got in the boat before he calmed the storm, which means Jesus put himself in the same boat with the disciples in the middle of that storm. Jesus doesn't wait till the storm is over before he comes to your side. He comes to you in the thick of it. When it's at the worst it could be, that's when he comes to your side to help you and give you aid and give you comfort. And because this is who Jesus is. He doesn't watch from afar and just say, good luck with everything, guys. He is a God that will come right to us in the middle of the worst of the worst. We see this no clearer than when Jesus became a human, right? He didn't sit in heaven and watch us. He became one of us and went through everything we go through. He chose to feel the pain that we feel. He chose to feel the sadness that we feel. He chose to cry the tears that we cry. Jesus cried. He knows what all this feels like. And just like with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you remember that story? They're thrown into the fire, the three of them? There's a fourth guy in the fire with them. Jesus, he doesn't wait till everything gets better to come. Right when it's as bad as it could get, that's when he comes to help us. And of course, you probably remember Matthew's part of the story. He adds a very important detail Mark leaves out, which is Jesus, sees, and Peter says, Lord, let me come and walk on the water with you. And Jesus says, all right, come out. And everything was going great. And I remember, man, and once again, I think of that, and I've seen cartoons, of this, not like goofy cartoons, but just like animated series of these stories. And when I remember watching one, and the sea's all calm when Peter gets out on the water, everything's wonderful. That's not how it was. And everything's going great until Peter takes his eyes off Jesus. He looks at the storm. But what did Jesus do when Peter took his eyes off him? Did he scold him or yell at him? Peter, how dare you? You are so stupid. I can't believe I let you come out on the boat with me. He doesn't say, Peter, you wanted to come out on the water, so you're going to have to get yourself back in the boat. No, he reaches out and he grabs him and he pulls him up. And he says, Peter, why are you doubting? Don't do that. But he just picks him right up. And I think of Psalm 23, David says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And I think it's safe to say that Jesus sits down at that table with us when he prepares it. And then verse 51, and Jesus got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped. And they were utterly astounded. Jesus also has the power to completely stop all these storms that happen. And those are wonderful moments. There are times when we need to learn, we need to grow through these storms, and Jesus doesn't stop them, but he's right there with us. But then there are times when he just stops the storm. When things are starting and things are bad, and we seek his face, and he completely calms the situation. And it makes those times so precious when we don't have to go through the storm because he completely removes it. But either way, whatever does happen, it's all for a purpose. And so, as we close this morning, as we wrap up this story of Jesus and the disciples, the devil wants us to think we're alone. He wants us to think that we've been abandoned, that the promises of God are not true. He whatever he can say to us, he's going to do. But we need to realize that when we're in a storm and we feel alone, Jesus, he's got his eyes on us. And if we call on him, he will come walking right out and get into that boat with us.